Nobody asked the most important question. Not the historians, not the scientists, not the journalists who spent decades writing about race, identity, and the African diaspora. The question was right there, sitting inside the double helix of millions of people's cells. And for centuries, everyone agreed, without saying a word, to look away. Because the answer threatened something. Not just a theory, not just a textbook chapter, something much more dangerous than that. It threatened the story entire nations had built their identities upon. Black Brazilians and Black Americans, two of the largest populations of African descent on the planet, both children of the same nightmare, the transatlantic slave trade, both told they came from Africa, both told they were connected. But when the DNA finally spoke, when the science cut through 4 centuries of silence, colonial record-keeping, and racial mythology, what came back was not what anyone expected, and what it revealed about who these people actually are, where they actually came from, and why they are so genetically different from each other despite sharing the same origin story. That is what no one wanted to admit. Until now. There's a number that almost nobody knows, and once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. Of all the Africans who were taken from their homes, packed into the belly of slave ships, and transported across the Atlantic in one of the most catastrophic forced migrations in human history, only 6% arrived in what is now the United States of America. 6%. Read that again. Of the 10 to 16 million human beings who survived that crossing, only 6 out of every 100 ended up on American soil. And yet, by 1860, the United States held approximately 2/3 of all enslaved people in the entire Western Hemisphere. That is not a contradiction. That is a clue, a biological clue. And it changes everything about what the DNA of Black Americans actually looks like, and why it looks so radically different from the DNA of Black Brazilians, who descended from a population that received nearly half of all Africans brought to the New World. This is where the story really begins. Brazil was not a similar story told in a different language. Brazil was an entirely different experiment in human suffering, one that operated on a scale the United States never approached. Between 1525 and the mid-1800s, approximately 4.9 million Africans were forcibly transported to Brazilian shores. That is more than 12 times the number who arrived in the United States. 12 times. Brazil became, without exaggeration, the single largest destination for enslaved Africans in the history of the Atlantic world, absorbing nearly 46% of all enslaved people brought to the Americas. The sugar plantations of Bahia and Pernambuco, the gold mines of Minas Gerais, the coffee fields of São Paulo, they were engines of consumption, not just of labor, but of human beings. The death rate in Brazilian slavery was so catastrophically high, and the birth rate so crushingly low, that the enslaved population could not sustain itself through natural reproduction. New ships had to keep coming, from Angola, from the Congo, from Nigeria, from Ghana, from Benin. The trade continued in Brazil until approximately 1850, 42 years after the United States officially closed its doors to the transatlantic slave trade in 1808. And it lasted in total for over 350 years. The American institution lasted 246. Think about what that means for the DNA. In the United States, slavery operated on a different biological logic. The enslaved population in the American South had an approximately equal sex ratio. It had a comparatively high birth rate. And critically, it became predominantly American-born within a few generations. This means that while Brazilian enslaved populations were constantly being replenished with direct arrivals from the African continent, people who had just left their villages, who remembered their languages and their kingdoms and their gods, the enslaved population in the United States was, generation by generation, becoming more removed from that direct African connection. The American-born enslaved person of 1820 might have been 3, 4, or 5 generations removed from their last African-born ancestor. Their genetic diversity, while rich, was progressively filtered through a narrower and narrower bottleneck of families who had already mixed, adapted, and in many cases been forced through the violence of rape and coercion to absorb European genetic material as well. And here is where it gets darker. Research published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, using data from hundreds of thousands of genetic markers, revealed that the median proportion of European ancestry among African Americans is 18.5%. Not zero, not a small footnote. Nearly 1 in 5 pieces of genetic code carried by the average Black American traces not to West Africa, but to Europe. The overwhelming majority of it the result of sexual violence during the centuries of enslavement. A separate Harvard-led analysis determined that a staggering 35% of all African American men carry DNA from a white male ancestor who fathered a child with an enslaved woman during the slavery era. Not a small number of cases, not isolated incidents. A systematic, generational pattern of coerced reproduction that is now permanently written into the genome of tens of millions of people. And what makes this finding even more unsettling is the variation. Across individuals who all identify as African American, people who share a community, a culture, a political identity, the proportion of West African ancestry ranges from as little as 1% to as much as 99%. The same identity, completely different biological stories. But here is where it gets worse. The story is not just about European admixture, it is also about which African ancestry survived and which did not. The African ethnic groups most represented in the enslaved population brought to the United States were primarily from the coastal regions of West Africa, from the area of present-day Senegal, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Nigeria, and the broader Niger-Congo linguistic zone, Yoruba lineages, Igbo lineages, Akan lineages. These are the primary African threads woven into the genetic identity of Black Americans. But the geographic concentration was narrower, the numbers were smaller, and the generational distance from Africa grew longer with each passing decade. That filtering has a name in genetics. It is called a population bottleneck. And bottlenecks leave fingerprints that last for centuries. Now turn your attention to Brazil. When researchers from the University of São Paulo conducted what became the most comprehensive genomic study in Brazilian history, published in the journal Science in May 2025, covering 2,123 individuals with full genome sequencing, what they found shattered the comfortable mythology that Brazil had long told about itself. The study, led by population geneticist Tabita Hunemeyer, revealed something that official Brazilian identity had spent generations papering over. The average Brazilian carries approximately 59% European ancestry, 27% African ancestry, and 13% Indigenous American ancestry. But those are averages for the entire Brazilian population. Within the specifically Afro-Brazilian communities, the picture is wildly different. And within the quilombos, the communities founded by escaped enslaved Africans, the genetic descendants of people who fled rather than submit, the African ancestry percentage rises dramatically. In rural Quilombo communities in central Brazil, African genetic ancestry reaches as high as 63%. Some Quilombo communities show a far less diluted genetic profile than many communities that officially identify as Black elsewhere in the country. But the study's most revealing finding was not in the percentages, it was in the source. The African ancestry in Brazil does not come from one place. It comes from multiple distinct and genetically traceable African populations. Populations that are, in some cases, quite different from those that produced the Black American genetic profile. The majority of the African genetic lineages in Brazil trace back to Bantu-speaking peoples from Central and West Central Africa, specifically from regions corresponding to modern-day Angola, Congo, and Mozambique. These were the people brought to work the sugar fields and gold mines. Their DNA, particularly along the maternal mitochondrial line, is the dominant African signal in much of Brazil's south and southeast. But overlapping and interweaving with that Central African layer is a significant West African signal. Yoruba ancestry from what is now Nigeria and Benin, Fon lineages, Akan threads, particularly concentrated in the states of Bahia and the northeast, where the slave trade from the Bight of Benin was most intense. In the 19th century, there were periods in Bahia where 8 Africans lived for every Portuguese person in the region. The demographic reality was African. The political reality was colonial, and the DNA remembers both. What this means is that Black Brazilians, particularly those in the Northeast and in Quilombo communities, carry a more complex, more varied, more geographically diverse African genetic signature than their Black American counterparts. Not because their suffering was worse, but because the mechanics of the slave trade deposited people from a broader range of African origins onto Brazilian soil over a longer period of time. Black Americans are largely descended from a West African gene pool that was then subjected to centuries of genetic mixing, bottlenecking, and European admixture within the United States. Black Brazilians, at least those whose communities maintained greater isolation from European mixing, carry African lineages that are, in some cases, more directly traceable to specific ethnic groups on the African continent. And this is where everything changes. Because what science is now able to do, what was impossible even 20 years ago and is now routine, is read those lineages with extraordinary precision. The 2025 Brazilian Genome Study identified over 8 million previously unknown single nucleotide variants in the Brazilian population, 8 million genetic letters that had never been cataloged in any database before. Among those, over 36,000 were flagged as potentially pathogenic, potentially linked to disease, hidden biological risks that had never been identified because the global genomic research community had spent decades studying primarily European populations and had never sequenced Brazilians at this scale. The scars of slavery, it turns out, are not just historical. They are biological. They are medical. They're still causing harm right now in hospital wards and cardiology clinics and cancer treatment centers because the genetic variants responsible for elevated health risks in Afro-Brazilian populations were never properly mapped, never properly studied, never properly understood, because these populations were never properly seen. In the United States, a parallel story has been unfolding. The genetic profile of Black Americans makes them more susceptible to certain diseases at higher rates than the general population. Hypertension, certain forms of kidney disease, specific cancer profiles, and researchers have long struggled to determine how much of that disparity is genetic, how much is environmental, and how much is the compounded biological consequence of centuries of stress, malnutrition, and trauma. The genome studies are beginning to provide answers, but the answers are complicated by the very admixture that makes the Black American genetic profile so variable. You cannot make a clean clinical recommendation based on race when the genetic reality underneath that racial identity is a spectrum running from 1% to 99% African ancestry. The science is telling medicine that the category is not precise enough, that what we call race is a social construction sitting on top of a biological reality that is far messier, far more varied, and far more consequential than the label suggests. What most people are not seeing is that this is not just an academic debate. This is a life and death medical crisis, hiding inside a conversation about identity. And yet, and this is perhaps the most haunting finding of all, despite the genetic differences between Black Brazilians and Black Americans, despite the different proportions of African, European, and Indigenous ancestry, despite the different African ethnic origins that dominate each population's genome, there is a remarkable convergence in their social and economic realities. Both communities sit at the bottom of their respective societies by almost every measurable indicator. In Brazil, despite Afro-Brazilians comprising over 56% of the total population, making Brazil the country with the second largest Black population on Earth after Nigeria, they earn on average 45% less than white Brazilians. They are dramatically underrepresented in elite universities, in corporate leadership, in government and medical schools. They die younger. They are incarcerated at disproportionate rates. They live in the neighborhoods that flood first, receive emergency services last, and are policed most aggressively. The 2022 Brazilian census marked a historic moment, the first time that multiracial people outnumbered any other single group in the country, comprising 45% of the population. White Brazilians now make up 43%. Only about 10% of Brazilians identify specifically as Black. And in that gap, in the space between the genetic reality of widespread African ancestry and the political reality of very few Brazilians choosing to identify as Black, lies the full weight of what racial ideology does to a people. Brazil spent generations promoting a concept called racial democracy. The idea that because everyone mixed, racism in Brazil was somehow softer, somehow less real, somehow more forgivable than the explicitly segregated racism of the American South. This was, according to informed sources in the sociological and historical literature, one of the most effective tools of white supremacy ever deployed in the Americas. Not legal apartheid, not Jim Crow, something more insidious, a mythology that made racism invisible by making race itself seem unimportant. If everyone is a little bit of everything, then who can claim to be harmed? The answer, which the DNA is now making impossible to ignore, is that the people with the most African ancestry, regardless of how they self-identify, regardless of how they appear to their neighbors, regardless of what box they check on a census form, are the ones at the bottom. Always, consistently, across generations. The genome does not care about the myth of racial democracy. The genome tells the truth about power. According to informed sources in Brazilian genomic research, one of the most politically charged findings of the 2025 science study was the asymmetry in the ancestry of the maternal versus paternal line. In Brazil, the maternal lineage, the mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child across unbroken generations, shows a dramatically higher proportion of African and Indigenous ancestry, while the paternal Y chromosome line is dominated by European ancestry. What this means, in historical terms, is not subtle. It means that the genetic mixing that created the Brazilian population was not mutual. It was not the product of love affairs and cultural exchange and voluntary union. It was the product of European men having children with African and Indigenous women. It was colonial sexual violence, encoded in the genome and readable 500 years later by a machine in a laboratory in São Paulo. As one geneticist on the study noted, the scars of Brazil's colonization process are too deep to be forgotten, and they are, in the most literal possible sense, embedded in the population's DNA. The same asymmetry appears, though in different proportions, in the African American genome. The elevated proportion of European ancestry that we discussed earlier, that 18.5% median, is not evenly distributed across the X chromosome and the autosomes. The X chromosome in African Americans shows elevated levels of African ancestry, which is consistent with a sex-biased pattern of gene flow, European men and African women. Not the reverse. The direction of the gene flow in both Brazil and the United States, written in two completely different populations on two completely different continents, tells the same story. The same story. Different country, different century, different language, same violence. And now, in the year 2025, the descendants of those violated women are swabbing their cheeks and mailing their DNA to laboratories and waiting 6 to 8 weeks to find out who they actually are. And the answers are not always what they expected. There are black Brazilians in the Northeast who assumed, based on family lore and regional culture, that they were primarily of Yoruba origin, only to discover that their maternal line traces to Bantu-speaking peoples from what is now Angola. There are African Americans in the Deep South whose family identity is built around a specifically West African heritage who discover that they carry significant Indigenous American or even unexpected Central African lineage. There was the famous case from DNA do Brasil, the landmark study which preceded the 2025 Science publication, where a black activist who had spent decades organizing around his presumed Yoruba heritage received his DNA results and discovered that his maternal line was entirely European. That result did not make him less black. It did not erase his cultural identity or his political commitment, but it forced a reckoning with something uncomfortable. That identity and ancestry are not the same thing, and that the story we tell about ourselves is sometimes the story we need, not the story the evidence supports. The real story, the one that the DNA is telling slowly and without apology, is that both of these communities are the product of catastrophic historical violence, and that the violence did not end with the abolition of slavery. It continued through the genetics of forced reproduction. It continued through the economics of structural racism. It continues now through the medical disparities that emerge from genomic data that was never collected, never studied, never prioritized, because the populations it describes were never prioritized. Brazil abolished slavery in 1888. The United States abolished it in 1865. In the decades that followed, both countries engaged in deliberate programs of what historians call whitening. Brazil explicitly so, with government policies designed to encourage European immigration and dilute the African genetic and cultural presence in Brazilian society. The Brazilian elite, confronted with a population that was majority African descended after centuries of the slave trade, decided that the solution to this demographic reality was not inclusion. It was dilution. European immigrants from Italy, Germany, Portugal, and Eastern Europe were invited in, subsidized, and settled in ways that African-descended Brazilians were not. The racial composition of Brazil's south, which today shows the lowest proportion of African ancestry of any region, is not an accident of geography. It is the fingerprint of a deliberate racial engineering project carried out in plain sight, while the mythology of racial democracy was simultaneously being constructed to ensure that no one would notice or complain or organize against it. In the United States, the equivalent project was not immigration-based, but geographic. The Great Migration, which saw millions of black Americans move from the South to northern cities between 1910 and 1970, was, among other things, a movement of genes. Research on the genomics of the Great Migration has confirmed that this massive internal migration also caused a significant shift in the regional distribution of African American genetic profiles. African ancestry proportions are, on average, higher in the southern United States than in the North and West. A reflection of the fact that the deepest African genetic lineages remained concentrated, where slavery itself was most deeply entrenched, while those who migrated north were more likely to carry higher proportions of European admixture, a legacy of the greater prevalence of mixed-race relationships in border states and urban environments. What most people are not seeing is that these are not just historical footnotes. These genomic patterns have real present-day consequences for how disease presents, how drugs work, how communities inherit both resilience and vulnerability across generations. And then there is the question of the quilombos. The quilombos of Brazil are perhaps the most extraordinary living genetic archive on the planet. These are the communities built by people who escaped slavery, who ran into the jungle, the swamps, the mountains, and established free communities that survived for centuries. The most famous, Palmares, was an entire nation of escaped slaves that operated in the interior of northeastern Brazil from approximately 1605 until it was finally destroyed by colonial military forces in 1694. At its height, Palmares had a population of over 20,000 people, an independent African Brazilian civilization existing in parallel with the slave society that surrounded it. Today, there are over 3,000 officially recognized Quilombo communities in Brazil, with populations ranging from a few dozen to several thousand people. And when geneticists go into those communities and sequence their DNA, what they find is a genetic signal that is, in many cases, closer to the African continent than almost any other community in the Americas. The rural Calunga Quilombo in central Brazil shows an African ancestry proportion of over 63%, significantly higher than most self-identified black Brazilians in urban areas. These communities, by isolating themselves from the colonial world for centuries, preserved a genetic heritage that the rest of Brazil's admixed population had diluted away. There is no equivalent to the Quilombo in the United States. The maroon communities of Jamaica and Suriname are the closest parallel in the broader Americas. But on American soil, the conditions that allowed large-scale sustained communities of escaped slaves to operate for centuries simply did not exist in the same way. The geography was different. The military enforcement was different. And so the genetic archive that the quilombos represent, that living record of relatively uninterrupted African ancestry, preserved through centuries of deliberate cultural and geographic isolation, is a uniquely Brazilian phenomenon. It is, in its own haunting way, one of the most powerful testimonies to the resilience of a people who refused to be erased. According to the most current scientific understanding, the African ancestry carried by Black Brazilians and Black Americans is not simply African. It is specific. It is traceable to ethnic groups, to kingdoms, to geographic regions that can be pinpointed with increasing precision as genomic databases grow larger. Yoruba ancestry from Nigeria and Benin, Igbo ancestry from southeastern Nigeria, Akan ancestry from Ghana, Fon ancestry from Benin, Bantu ancestry from Angola, Congo, and Mozambique, Senegambian ancestry from the westernmost arc of the continent. Each of these groups had its own language, its own governance, its own art, its own cosmology, its own relationship to land and family and the sacred. The slave trade did not bring undifferentiated Africans to the Americas. It brought specific people from specific places, ripped from specific worlds, and then systematically stripped of the specific identities that made them who they were. What the DNA is now doing, slowly, painstakingly, one genome at a time, is giving back some of what was taken. Not everything. The names are gone. The languages are mostly gone. The oral histories were severed by the Middle Passage, but the biological signature remains, and it is speaking. The question that remains, the one that the science opens rather than closes, is what any of this means for the people living now. For the young Black Brazilian woman in Salvador de Bahia who takes a DNA test and discovers that her maternal line traces to the Yoruba kingdom, to a civilization that built cities and universities while European feudalism was still in its infancy. For the young Black American man in Atlanta who discovers that his genome carries Igbo ancestry, the lineage of a people so determined to resist enslavement that entire communities chose death over bondage. What does that knowledge do? Does it unite? Does it complicate? Does it create new solidarities or expose old fractures? Because here is the uncomfortable truth that the DNA also reveals. Race, as a social category, and ancestry, as a biological reality, are not the same thing. And the two communities, Black Brazilians and Black Americans, have built their identities, their political movements, their cultural expressions, and their very understanding of themselves on the social category, while the biological reality has remained, until very recently, largely invisible. The genetic data does not say that race is unimportant. What happened to these people happened because of race, because of how they were classified, how they were seen, how they were dehumanized. The consequences of that classification are ongoing. The disparities are real. But the data does say that the category is not as simple as it looks, that within the boundary of Black there are multitudes. Multitudes of ancestry proportions, multitudes of African ethnic origins, multitudes of histories that are similar in their trauma, but different in their specifics. And what no one wanted to admit, what the DNA is finally forcing into the open, is that the story of the African diaspora in the Americas is not one story. It is 1,000 stories, braided together by violence and survival, running through the chromosomes of millions of people who are only now, in the age of genomics, beginning to read the full text of their own origins. The two communities, Black Brazilian and Black American, are not mirrors of each other. They are not the same people in different countries. They are the distinct, complex, genetically specific products of two different slave systems, operating on two different continents, drawing from overlapping but not identical African source populations, and then subjecting those populations to 200 years of wildly divergent social, political, and biological pressures. The result is two communities that share a spiritual kinship and a historical wound, but whose genetic profiles are, in many measurable ways, as different as the continents that shape them. The 2025 genome study found over 8 million previously unknown genetic variants in the Brazilian population. 8 million letters of biological information that science had never read before. Among them, over 36,000 were potentially pathogenic, hidden landmines in the genome, waiting to express themselves as disease in bodies whose genetic profile had never been properly mapped. Think about what that means. For every year that the global scientific community focused its resources on studying European genomes, which has been the overwhelming bias of genomic research for the past 3 decades, there were 36,000 potentially dangerous genetic variants sitting undetected in the bodies of Afro-Brazilian people, causing disease, causing death, while the research apparatus of modern medicine looked elsewhere. This is not chaos. This is the structural consequence of who science decided was worth studying. The real question, the one that nobody in the mainstream conversation about race and identity and ancestry is fully confronting, is what happens next. Now that the DNA has spoken, now that the data exists, now that we know that these two communities are genetically distinct in ways that have direct medical consequences. Now that we know the maternal line tells a story of coercion, while the paternal line tells a story of conquest. Now that we know that within the broad category of Black, there are genomic realities so variable that clinical medicine cannot responsibly treat the category as a uniform entity. Now that we know that the scars of slavery are not metaphorical. They are written in the actual genome, in the ratio of African to European DNA, in the dominance of certain mitochondrial haplogroups, in the elevated disease risks that emerge specifically from the intersection of particular ancestries and particular historical conditions. Does that knowledge change anything? Does it force a reckoning? Or does it disappear into the same silence that swallowed the question for 400 years? The DNA has spoken. The laboratories have published. The journals have verified. And somewhere, in Salvador and Atlanta and Rio and Chicago and Sao Paulo and Detroit, millions of people are carrying the answer to this question in every cell of their body. The full, unredacted, scientifically legible account of everything that was done to them and everything that survived. The question is no longer whether the truth exists. The question is whether anyone with the power to act on it is listening. And if history is any guide, if the 350 years of deliberate silence on this continent and the 246 years of deliberate silence on that one are any indication, the answer to that question is perhaps the most dangerous data point of all.